Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so today we're exploring a really strange, almost invisible trap that catches, well, the absolute best of us. We naturally just assume that your polish, your flawless track record, and this glowing, untouchable reputation are the ultimate armor against failure. But what if they aren't armor at all? What if those exact things, literally the very traits that make you look incredibly successful, are actually the exact things setting you up to fail? Let's think about this for a second. We usually assume massive expectations act as fuel, right? We believe that if we demand greatness, greatness is just going to naturally follow. It's the standard playbook for high achievement. But what actually happens when that spotlight gets just a little too bright? What happens when those expectations turn into this heavy, suffocating weight, and you, the star performer, suddenly stumble? In that critical split-second moment, do you push harder, or do you quietly look for the nearest exit?
This leads us straight into a fascinating mental model called the high-performance paradox. It explains how the crushing psychological pressure of high expectations can actually cause our absolute top performers to just unexpectedly give up when they hit an early hurdle. Instead of fighting through the adversity, this profound fear of public embarrassment completely takes over. Their desperate need to manage their image, to protect that fragile ego, overrides their fundamental drive to succeed. Protecting that perfect image actually becomes way more important than crossing the finish line.
So to really unpack this, let's look at the context, starting with some classic wisdom on rising to the occasion.
The author of our newsletter, Papa, often shares a foundational piece of wisdom from his father, Papa Q-Bear. He used to say that the cream always rises. And what he meant by this is that when things inevitably go wrong, and let's be honest, they always do, no matter who you are, the truly capable figure out a way to succeed. But they don't do it through these sudden cinematic bursts of magical inspiration. No, they do it through gritty, unglamorous perspiration, sweat equity.
But here is the brutal reality of high performance. These folks are operating under a glaring, relentless spotlight, and the higher you climb up that ladder, the brighter and hotter that spotlight burns. For a star player, routine success is just expected. It's totally ignored. But even the smallest, most ordinary stumble, wow, that gets intensely magnified into a massive, highly visible disaster. The margin for error basically vanishes overnight.
Which brings us to the tension of our story. What actually happens when that spotlight simply becomes too hot? To see this tension play out in the real world, let's look at a massive study out of Wharton. Researchers analyzed over 328,000 professional men's tennis matches. That is a lot of data. Now, logically, you'd think the heavily favored champions, the ones everyone expects to dominate, would fight the absolute hardest when they find themselves down. But the data revealed the exact opposite. When those favorites lost the very first set, they were significantly more likely to just quit the match entirely, compared to the underdogs who also lost their first set.
So why in the world do these champions quit? Well, they do it to manage their image. Faking an injury or just stepping away provides a built-in, socially acceptable excuse. It acts as a shield, protecting the high performer from the agonizing, ego-destroying embarrassment of a public, undeniable failure. In their minds, they'd much rather take an incomplete grade than risk getting an F in front of a watching world. And, this desperate internal need to look good doesn't just affect how top performers act. It completely warps how we externally judge their talent in the very first place. Which naturally brings us to another brilliant mental model, Nassim Nicholas Taleb's famous surgeon paradox. Okay, I want you to imagine two surgeons of equal rank at the exact same prestigious hospital. One is immaculately dressed, perfectly articulate, maybe has perfectly styled silver hair. Basically, he looks like a refined, distinguished doctor straight out of central casting. Pristine white coat, the whole shebang. The other surgeon, well, he's unkempt, rough-spoken, maybe a bit overweight, and honestly looks a lot more like a local butcher from the market down the street.
Taleb boldly suggests that if you have to choose who operates on you, you should absolutely always pick the second one. Why? Because if someone who looks like a butcher has managed to survive and thrive in a prestigious, highly competitive medical role, their actual underlying skills must be absolutely phenomenal. They didn't coast by on some visual halo effect. They had to be so undeniably brilliant with a scalpel that the hospital had literally no choice but to keep them. They had to overcome the massive disadvantage of our deep visual biases just to get into the operating room. This forces a really profound realization. Appearances, smooth talk, aesthetic polish. These are often terrible proxies for real, tangible ability. They are the very things that generate the crushing expectations of the high-performance paradox, yet they tell us almost nothing about actual skill.
We become so easily fooled by the costume of competence that we completely forget to look for the actual substance underneath.
Now let's connect these ideas. How do we actually survive the spotlight by showing our work?
The absolute secret to surviving the spotlight and defeating both of these paradoxes is pulling back the curtain on your success. And you do this through 3 steps. First, setting crystal clear goals. Second, fighting your way through the messy middle. You know, that chaotic crucible where mistakes happen and gritty perspiration is totally required. And third, most importantly, proactively sharing your process with others.
You see, relying solely on your results is a really dangerous game. Results are like these bright, flashy numbers on a scoreboard. Everyone can see them, sure, but they completely lack context. They ignore the sheer luck of a market swing, the perfect timing of a product launch, the countless variables entirely outside your control, not to mention the sleepless nights of agonizing decision-making that actually led to the win. True high performers don't need to play the victim or ask for easier rules when things get tough. Instead, they actively manage the crushing expectations of the spotlight by showing their work. They explain the careful steps they took, the brutal choices they navigated, and the raw reasoning behind their actions. They give people the full, messy picture, not just the final score. And there is hard psychological science backing this up. Research shows that when we allow employees to share their process and talk through a setback, it literally shifts how their brain functions. It moves them out of a terrified, risk-avoiding state, what psychologists call a prevention focus, where you're just trying desperately not to lose. By sharing the process, they shift into an energetic, innovative mindset known as a promotion focus, where they are actively trying to win. They stop trying to hide, and they start trying to solve. It's a real game changer.
So let's synthesize all of this. It's really about balancing merit and appearance.
To avoid the traps of these paradoxes, we really need to weave these lessons together. First, we've got to set clearly defined, differentiated expectations. Second, we must actively coach our top performers through their inevitable early setbacks so they don't just quit out of pure embarrassment. And third, we absolutely must rigorously judge people by their true merit and their underlying process, looking way past their superficial polish.
However, we also have to acknowledge a basic, undeniable truth of human nature here. As Papa points out in our source material, we are ultimately visual creatures. So, while we shouldn't judge a book solely by its cover, putting a little extra effort into looking the part actually does serve a purpose. It demonstrates your focus, it shows you care about the tiny details, and that deliberate effort earns you the right to lead. Papa beautifully summarizes this delicate balance. He reminds us to always choose merit and actual undeniable capability as our guiding principle when evaluating others. But for ourselves, we must never forget that true leaders don't get a day off from setting the standard. You have to put in the gritty, unglamorous work, absolutely, but you also have to show up every single day ready to lead.
So, the next time you feel crushed by the massive weight of expectations, or you encounter a sudden failure that makes you just want to quit and hide, ask yourself, how are you going to pull back the curtain and let others see the messy, resilient, beautiful work behind your success?